Most committal services are fairly straightforward, but every now and then in this line of work, we get thrown a curveball. At Kelly Vault Company, we choose to set every single vault above the grave with the base suspended and the lid pushed back either away from the family or down towards the family. While it is rare, there are certain situations that prevent us from setting up over the grave. Today, that reason is a hillside. Because of how steep this hillside is, the funeral home makes the decision to have the committal service at the bottom of the hill. On a service such as this, we do what's called a false or mock setup. It just means that we present the vault to the best of our abilities away from the grave. Since there won't be a grave dug beneath the burial vault as it's displayed, we can't use our typical equipment to suspend the vault. The base will be placed on the ground and the lid will be propped up in front of the base. At this particular cemetery, we don't set the tent. The crew that takes care of the cemetery will come and set the tent after I have the vault displayed. The vault that the funeral home and the family chose for this service is a Wilbur cream-colored Venetian. The exterior of the vault is painted russet, which is a color that resembles a bronze finish. Over the russet is a copper highlight. The highlight brings out the two-tone texture of the base and on the edge of the lid of the vault. The lowering device will be placed directly above the base. Therefore, I want the base to be as level as possible to make sure that when the casket is placed on the lowering device, it doesn't want to have the tendency to roll or shift to either direction. The vault buggy that I'm using today is what's referred to as a Johnny Handler from True Rebel Equipment. A vault buggy like this is a lifesaver in this type of situation. Not only to make this job less strenuous on our bodies, but also to help keep us safe. This Wilbur Venetian weighs just shy of 3,000 pounds. One key feature of the Johnny Handler is that it has a crank system to be able to push and pull the vault out over the grave or over the ground. Without this crank and pulley, we would be using strictly manual labor to push the vault out over the grave or out over where we're going to set the vault. As you can see here, the winch hooks onto the cable that runs the length of the buggy, and we simply crank and it pulls the lid across the buggy to place it down until I'm ready to place it on the ground. This area is where the funeral home chooses to do the false setup so that the family can be seated looking at the casket in the vault and also look to their right and see the hillside where their loved one will be buried. But as you can guess by the fact that I needed to block up one end of the vault, we are on some unlevel ground. So unlevel, in fact, that the road sits up much higher than the grass, and I actually ran out of length on the extension arms of the buggy. Now hindsight is 20/20. I could have used some cinder blocks underneath the feet to help raise the boom of the buggy. But since I didn't do that, I was able to use the crank, which made it a lot easier than just using manual labor to push the lid back onto the buggy and push the entire vault back onto the buggy once it's sealed. Now personally, I don't intend to insult any other vault companies when I make this observation, but it is my personal preference. A lot of vault companies do not display their vaults in this way or in any way, shape, or form. At some cemeteries and at some vault companies, the base of the burial vault is placed into the grave long before the family arrives. The lid of the burial vault is kept on the vault cart or vault buggy off to the side without the view of the family. Now I've heard the argument that on concrete grave liners that's perfectly acceptable, and I will agree with that. A concrete grave liner's purpose is just to maintain the grave as the casket deteriorates. Without the use of a burial vault or concrete grave liner, over time the casket will deteriorate and the soil above the casket will also begin to sink and cave in to fill that blank space. That being said, the cemetery crew or the maintenance crew will constantly be adding more top seed, topsoil, and leveling out the graves. That fact is why most cemeteries, in my area especially in central Illinois and central Indiana, require some type of burial container to help maintain the flat look of the cemetery. Now it is my opinion that if you do purchase a burial vault for your loved one, or your loved one chooses a burial vault before they pass, that the family and those who chose it should be able to see what they purchased. If the vault base is simply placed in the bottom of the grave and the lid is off to the side, Not only does the family not get to see what they personalize and what they chose for the loved one, but they also can't see the process of the vault being sealed. When the base is in the ground and the lid is off to the side, there's no way of knowing that the vault is perfectly aligned when the lid is placed over the casket. The butyl adhesive that provides the seal on these burial vaults is housed in the groove of the lid. At Kelly Vault Company, we choose to suspend every vault, that way the family can witness the sealing process. As you may have seen in some of my other videos, when the family witnesses the lowering, the casket is lowered into the base of the burial vault. The lid is then pushed over the base, and the base is raised into the lid. By doing this above ground, we can guarantee that the lid is precisely centered over the base to make sure the tongue of the base fits perfectly into the groove of the lid, which then disperses the seal around the tongue and provides a quality air and watertight seal. When the base is in the bottom of the grave, not only is there no way to see the seal or see the lip of the base, but also dirt and debris from the sides of the grave may fall into the base, keeping the seal from working properly. That is why we suspend every vault above the grave, even the concrete grave liners, just to make sure that that lid is perfectly aligned with the base. But now that we have the vault set up on display for the family when they arrive, it's now time to get ready for the second aspect of this committal service setup. I need to construct a safe and stable platform to support the weight of the burial vault once it has been sealed and it's ready to be lowered into the plot. Since I won't be setting out carpets and family won't be up around the grave, I don't have to worry as much about the aesthetic look of my platform. My main concern is making sure that it's stable and level. Now on this hillside, the grade is around 2 feet lower than at the top of the grave, so the bottom of the platform will have to be built up many times to make this platform level. This is probably one of the most nerve-wracking parts of this job, simply because a vault can be replaced if I make an error. If I damage a vault, we can have another vault at the cemetery within the next hour. The difference on this situation is that the casket will have already been sealed inside the vault when I'm maneuvering around these obstacles. It's a high possibility that the family will also be witnessing the interment process while I'm using the buggy to lower the vault into the grave. So needless to say, I need to make sure that everything is perfect and safe. The last thing we want to do as a vault man is to make an error on a funeral setup that prevents the family from having the setup that they deserve. But the last thing we would ever want to do is make some type of error or catastrophic mistake when the loved ones are present and their loved one has already been sealed inside the vault. By nature, I'm personally an optimist, so I try to find the good in everything, but I'm also a realist and I'm careful with my work. And I know that if I were to lose control of this vault buggy with the vault already on the buggy, it could not only take out tens of thousands of dollars worth of headstones on its way barreling down the hill, but if it doesn't get stopped, the vault buggy could very likely go all the way down the hill, across the road, and into the pond. So needless to say, I'm more than cautious. While I wait for the cemetery crew to set the tent and chairs, I see if there's any fish in this little pond, and even with a broken fishing rod, catching a few fish is not a bad time. Even if they are some tiny sunfish. But break time is over, and it's time to get back to work. The procession has arrived, the minister has spoken, and the family has moved on to the luncheon or repast, leaving me, a funeral director, and the cemetery crew to complete the work. The first step of the process is to lower the casket into the burial vault and remove the lowering device so that the lid can be placed above the vault. Now, we have explored different options of making these committal services possible on this hillside, but we've come to an agreement with the cemetery and the funeral home that sealing the vault at the bottom of the hill and using the buggy to inter the vault is the best option available, making sure that the pallbearers do not have to traverse the hillside to place the casket over the grave. Even with the healthiest pallbearers available, there are a lot of stones in the section on the hillside, so maneuvering through the aisles and between the rows is extremely difficult, and if one person catches the edge of a foundation, it could mean disaster for not only the family members, the casket, and the person who has passed. So while we always prefer to seal the vault over the grave, this is the best option for this situation. Now that the casket has been lowered and the lowering device has been removed, it's time to pick up the lid and place it back on the buggy. And one thing we're very careful about is making sure that the vault will be placed in the grave correctly aligned. In many traditions and cultures around the world, those who have passed are buried facing the rising sun. In fact, the tradition of burying facing east can be traced back as far as the Aztecs, who worshipped the sun god. And knowing this person was a Christian, I made sure that we placed the casket head first onto the lowering device, so that when I loaded up the lid and placed the lid on the vault, the feet would be at the east and the emblem would be at the west. Which is one of the responsibilities as a vault man, is to also notify the funeral director when they arrive which direction they would like the casket placed on the device. So after making sure that the casket is correctly aligned, I can raise one side of the lid, remove the support box that propped up the vault lid, and attach the other two cables to place the lid back onto the buggy. And as I mentioned previously, since we're on this slight hillside, I should have used some cinder blocks underneath the boom of my buggy. Using the crank to let the lid out over the ground was very, very easy because the weight naturally wanted to move towards the west. To place the lid back onto the buggy was a different story. I sure got a shoulder workout cranking this lid back onto the buggy and the basin lid as well afterwards. But now it's time for a critically important step, making sure that the lid is properly aligned over the base. Now when I set the lid down, a little piece of the blanket that was protecting the carapace was caught under the edge of the vault. So I need to make sure that I remove that piece and make sure there's no debris on the seal whatsoever. In the shop, we use pieces of paper and corner supports to store the vaults to make sure that the lid doesn't seal to the base before the interment process. We also need to make sure that none of those pieces of paper remain before the sealing process. We can now align the Johnny handler over the vault base to make sure that the lid is properly aligned with the edges of the base. Each funeral director is slightly different. Some offer as much help as they can, others watch from the air conditioning of the hearse, and any help is appreciated, but we also understand that this is not part of their job. This is our responsibility at this point, and they're just here to witness to make sure that we're doing our job correctly. Each state has its own regulations, but in most states, the funeral director is required to stay until the vault is sealed or the vault is sealed and lowered into the grave. Some funeral directors choose to stay until they make sure the cables are removed. It all depends on the funeral director and which state I'm working in. We can now align the vault lid over the base and be sure that the tongue and groove will have a perfect seal. Around 2 years ago, I was involved with a disinterment out of Detroit, Michigan, which is around 5.5 hours away from the shop. When I arrived at the cemetery, they already had the vault disinterred and was waiting for me to pick it up. When it was relocated to its new cemetery, the family requested to have a new burial vault. The vault was interred in 1964 in a Wilbert burial vault from what looked like a Venetian, and the name may have been different at the time, but we assumed that was the closest match to what we have today, so we paint matched a new Venetian to what was placed in 1964 and got to work attempting to remove the lid off of the burial vault. We suspended the vault by the hooks on the top of the lid, hoping that the base would break free, with no success. The next option was prying the lid off, with no success as well. It wasn't until we were able to knock some chunks of concrete and cut the liner away that we were able to pry the lid off the base. And while it is anecdotal evidence, the disinterments that I've been involved in all resulted in a dry casket on the interior of a quality Wilbert burial vault. One thing that has tarnished the reputation of burial vaults in general is the virality of pre-installed burial vaults. Burial vaults that are installed long before the death of the person that the vault belongs to. Some cemeteries use this practice to get the sale of the burial vault up front, and when they install the burial vault, there is no seal installed in any way, shape, or form. The vault is placed in the bottom of the grave, with the seal either laying on the inside of the vault or not existing in the vault at all. When that individual does pass, the grave is redug and the vault lid is removed. Obviously, without an adhesive seal, the lid comes right off, and the interior of the vault is filled with water, dirt, and sediment. At Kelly Vault Company, we do not do any type of pre-installed burial vaults. In my opinion, it's just a way to get a sale before it's necessary, and it hinders the quality of the product itself. Not everyone is concerned with outside factors getting towards the casket, but if you are a family that's concerned with that, then doing a pre-installed burial vault makes no sense in my opinion. But now that the vault is sealed, we can place it back onto the buggy and secure the buggy down to transport the buggy to the top of the hillside to where I'll be navigating through the stones to get to the grave. The way we navigate the vault to the grave all depends on the conditions of the cemetery. If there were an open path to go up the hill from the bottom side, I may use that path. If there is no path from the top or bottom, I would have to drive down the rows in between the stones from the side. Our main concern is keeping the vault buggy as level as possible in situations like this. Speaking personally, I'd rather go from the bottom in every chance possible. That way I know my path, and if something were to fail, or if I were to lose control of the buggy, I could steer the buggy back down the path I drove up. Today I have to go downhill from the top, which means I'm going to take it extra slow, make sure I've got my hand on the parking brake, and if anything doesn't feel right, I immediately stop and pull back forward. Low and slow is the safest bet in situations like this. One thing that does help out a vault man is watching the way that the grave diggers open the grave and which path they chose to drive through. This cemetery uses a small excavator and a mule with a dump bed on the back to haul the dirt away. Since I could tell where the grave diggers had already made a path, I knew that that path was safe and that there weren't going to be any cave-ins if I were to drive into a void in the earth, a groundhog hole, anything that could make the buggy sink in, bounce, or just get jostled in any way I want to avoid. So I'll use the well-beaten path from the grave diggers. And luckily it's been incredibly dry lately, so I don't have to worry about the mud or losing grip with my tires. While I typically choose to do an end shot with the vault buggy, today that wasn't an option. The low end of the grave did not have a headstone in the way, but because of how high my platform has to be to ensure that it's level, it was too high for me to raise the buggy up over the base of the platform. So today I'll have to do a shot from the side and spin the vault in the air, making sure the feet are facing east. At times we do need to clarify with the cemetery or the funeral home to make sure that the grave is in the right spot. The headstone for the person that I'm laying to rest today is at the foot end of the grave, but because of the hillside, all the stones are set up in this manner so that they can be read from the bottom of the hill. The next step of the process is to extend the boom and pull the vault out over the grave before spinning it, making sure it's aligned correctly. I also leave an aluminum board down in the middle, just in case I did not line my boom up correctly and the vault needs to be shifted towards the east or the west. In that situation, I could set the vault down on that aluminum board and adjust my feet to either side to make sure that the vault is aligned perfectly and won't catch either end of the grave. One thing that really helps in this situation is the Johnny handler. It has 3 hydraulic posts, including the front wheel, and 2 hydraulic posts behind the back tires. This allows me to level out the buggy so that the vault doesn't swing and slam up against one side of the cart when the weight of the vault is lifted off the platform. And it is a question I get quite often is why do I work alone? Well, there are very few situations where I would vouch that this is a 2-man job, and this is one of those situations. It would be nice to have a second set of eyes while I control the remote to make sure that everything is aligned properly. But luckily, the cemetery crew at this cemetery are fantastic, and they help me out, just give me an extra set of eyes to make sure everything went smooth. I would say in the majority of the cases, the vault men and the cemetery crew work extremely well together to make sure that the job is done right for the family. The only thing left to do is to make sure that this vault clears all 4 sides of the grave and sits level at the bottom. As a vault man, we're the last line of defense. We are the last step in the process, and we have one of the more important jobs in the funeral industry. This is the last step of the process in the entire funeral experience, and to make sure that everything goes well in this situation is pivotal, Because if anything bad happens, that is probably going to be the main thing that the family remembers from the entire experience. And the last thing we would want is for anything to go wrong with their loved one in our care. Now that the vault is safely placed at the bottom of the grave, the funeral director is free to leave, and it's time for me to get torn down and for the cemetery crew to begin the backfilling process. And like I said, having an extra set of hands really comes in handy at times, because this vault cart on a hillside can be incredibly awkward to handle by yourself. There are many different methods that cemeteries use to backfill the graves. Sometimes they leave a dirt pile with just enough dirt to fill the grave. Other times they use a dump truck that backs up right to the grave. And other times they use a dump trailer or a gator with a dump bed on it, just like they are here today. A lot of families request at least a ceremonial handful of dirt to place on the vault once it is sealed and lowered, and other families prefer to have the entire dirt pile left so that them and their family members and friends can fill the grave by hand. It all just depends on the cemetery and the equipment that they're working with. So in a sense, that is what a unique day for a vault man is like, and how we present a false setup for a service that's too dangerous for the pallbearers to walk the casket to the grave. Take care, and God bless.